Somewhere in a church in Warsaw, sealed inside a stone pillar, there is a heart floating in a jar of alcohol. It has been there since 1849. It survived a world war, a Nazi occupation, and at one point got smuggled around Poland for safekeeping, like contraband. It belonged to a man who was 5'7", weighed about as much as a large dog by the end of his life, and could reduce entire Parisian ballrooms to tears using 10 fingers and a piano. This is the story of Frédéric Chopin, a man so committed to being dramatic that he arranged to be buried in 2 different countries at once. He showed up in 1810 in a village called Żelazowa Wola, just outside Warsaw, to a French father who taught languages for a living, and a Polish mother who apparently played piano well enough to make the baby stop crying. Little Frédéric took this as a personal challenge. By age 6, he was reportedly weeping at the piano when things sounded beautiful, which is either the most sensitive childhood on record or the earliest known case of a toddler having main character energy. By 7, he'd composed his first piece. By 8, he was performing in public and being called, because 19th century Europe never met a hyperbole it didn't like, the second Mozart. Somewhere out there is a kid who just wanted to play with blocks and instead got compared to the most famous musician in history before he lost his baby teeth. Warsaw doted on him. He studied at the conservatory, wrote music that already sounded unmistakably like him, and by his late teens was good enough that his teachers had essentially run out of things to correct. Then, in 1830, at 20 years old, he left for a concert tour of Vienna and Paris, fully intending to come back. Poland had other plans. An uprising broke out against Russian rule almost the moment he left. It got crushed, and Chopin found himself politically unable to go home. He spent the rest of his life a 19-hour carriage ride from the country he never stopped calling his own, which explains why so much of his music sounds like homesickness set to a dance rhythm. The mazurkas and polonaises he wrote were Polish folk dances smuggled into concert halls, which is a very on-brand way for an exile to say, "I'm fine." Paris in the 1830s was basically a small, extremely well-dressed pressure cooker of famous people, and Chopin walked straight into the middle of it. He became friends and occasionally competitors with Franz Liszt, a man who played piano the way a house fire spreads. Liszt could reduce a concert hall to screaming fans 200 years before that was a normal thing bands did. Chopin took one look at that circus and noped straight out of it. He hated performing for big crowds, found the whole spectacle exhausting, and preferred playing in small, candlelit salons for maybe 30 people who actually understood what he was doing. In his entire career, he gave only around 30 public concerts total, which for a musician this famous is almost insultingly few. He was essentially the original guy who was incredible at his job and still somehow introverted about it. The painter Eugene Delacroix, who at the time was busy inventing what we now call romantic painting, became one of Chopin's closest friends and left us the best physical description we have of him, sketching and painting him with the kind of intensity usually reserved for saints or storms. The two of them would apparently sit around discussing music and philosophy like it was the most normal thing in the world, which, if you're going to have a hangout, is a pretty solid guest list. And then there was George Sand, real name Amantine Lucille Aurora Dupin, a novelist who wore men's clothing in public decades before that was socially survivable, smoked cigars, and used a male pen name because publishing was even more unfair to women then than it is now. She and Chopin had a relationship that lasted roughly a decade, and by all accounts, it was intense, complicated, and occasionally the subject of gossip across half of Europe. At one point, the pair, along with her 2 children, decided a warmer climate would help Chopin's already fragile lungs, so they set off for the island of Mallorca. This trip is remembered less as a romantic getaway and more as a masterclass in how not to plan a vacation. They rented rooms in an abandoned monastery. The winter turned out to be freezing and relentlessly rainy. The locals grew suspicious of Chopin's coughing and assumed tuberculosis meant plague, and landlords reportedly wanted the mattresses burned after they left. Somehow, in the middle of this soggy nightmare, Chopin wrote some of his most beautiful and haunting music, the preludes, including one so eerie with its repeating notes that people still argue about whether it's describing raindrops or a funeral. Genius, it turns out, does not require good weather. It just requires suffering in a sufficiently atmospheric location. By his mid-30s, Chopin was a legitimate European celebrity, nicknamed the Poet of the Piano, admired by royalty, adored by the Parisian salons, and quietly falling apart physically the entire time. He had been sick for most of his adult life, almost certainly with tuberculosis, the disease that spent the entire 19th century acting like main character energy in every artist's biography. He kept composing anyway, kept teaching piano lessons to aristocratic students to pay rent, and kept being, by every account, a genuinely funny and warm person in private, even as his public image calcified into tragic romantic genius. Friends described him doing spot-on impressions of people, which is a delightfully petty skill to have alongside invented the modern piano ballade. His last big trip was to Britain in 1848, dragged along partly by well-meaning friends and partly by the need for income, where he performed for exhausted crowds while visibly running out of strength, at one point needing to be carried upstairs to reach the piano. He came back to Paris in worse shape than he left, and by October of 1849, he was gone, at only 39 years old, surrounded by friends, having reportedly asked that his body be cut open before burial because he had a very reasonable 19th century fear of being buried alive. Which brings us back to that jar. Chopin's body was buried in Paris, at Père Lachaise Cemetery, where it remains today under a monument that fans still visit constantly. But his heart, at his own request, was removed, preserved, and smuggled back to Warsaw by his sister, hidden, the story goes, under her skirts to get it past Russian border guards, before finally being sealed inside a pillar at the Holy Cross Church, where it still sits. So Frédéric Chopin, a man who spent his whole adult life exiled from the country he loved, found a way to go home after all. He just did it in two pieces, on two different continents, in the most Chopin way imaginable. Dramatic to the very last beat.